Hey, fifth grade. Today we're going to be going over page 77 from your math workbook. This was your homework last night so that you are ready for your chapter 3 decimals test. So looking at page 77, chapter 3 extra practice, we're going to start in the section that says write the value of the underlined digit. And we're going to be starting with number 3 from that page. So if you looked at this question, they have the 8 underlined, and the 8 is in the tenths place. So if I'm telling the value what it's worth, I could have written this one of two ways. I could have written as 0 and 8 tenths, or you could have written it as a digit and the name of the place value. Either way is an acceptable way to write the answer to question number 3. All right, let's go on and look at number 4. Number 4 says 194 thousandths. So if you look at the 4, this is tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I could have written 4 thousandths, or either one of those answers would be acceptable from the homework last night. All right, let's go on to number 5. And all this was stuff that we reviewed yesterday and we've gone over throughout the chapter. So now we have 11 and 776 thousandths. Now this 7 is in the hundredths place. So in order to tell the value of it, all the other digits turn into zeros and the 7 goes in the hundredths place. So I could write it this way, or I can write it as 7 hundredths. Either way would be an acceptable answer. So I hope you're checking your papers. And the last one in the section, number 6. And in this case, the 1 is underlined. And the 1 in this case is in the thousandths place. So that's an acceptable answer, or 1,000th. Either one of those is an acceptable answer. And that's from lessons 3.1 to 3.2, numbers 3 through 6. So now we're going to move on to the next section. This is lessons 3.3 to 3.4. And the first one wants us to put them in order from greatest to least. And they give us these numbers: 5 and 6 thousandths, 5 and 917 thousandths, 5 and 8 hundredths, and 5 and 99 hundredths. So when I'm going to put these in order from greatest to least, I'm looking for biggest to smallest. So first thing I do is start over here in the ones place to compare them. So if I look in the ones place, I see they all have a 5. So I cannot compare. Look for the biggest number there. I cannot do that because all the 5s are the same. So I have to move to the tenths place. And what I see here is that there's 2 numbers that have a 9 in the tenths place. So what I'm going to have to do is go over here to the hundredths place, and this is where I'm going to have to compare these numbers. So when I look in the hundredths place in this number, I see a 9, and when I look in the hundredths place here, I see a 1. Well, I know 9 is greater than 1, so this is my greatest number. So when you wrote them down on the line underneath, this should have been first on your list. Then this number should have been second. And then we'll go back to the beginning to look at these 2 numbers here. So if I start in the ones place, they both have a 5. They both have a 0 in the tenths place. So again, I have to go to the hundredths place. And when I do that, I see this number has an 8 and this has a 0. Well, I know 8 is greater than 0. So that's going to be number 3. And this is going to be my smallest or my least number. So on your line, you should have written 5 and 99 hundredths, then 5 and 917 thousandths, then 5 and 8 hundredths, and lastly you should have written 5 and 6 thousandths. So that should be the correct order on your paper for this is number 1 in section 3.3, 3.4. All right, now let's go on to, this is number 2 in the same section. And they gave you these 4 numbers, 823 thousandths, 1 and 823 thousandths, 732 thousandths, and 832 thousandths. So the process is the same. I'm looking for the greatest number. That was the directions on your test. Make sure you're paying attention to whether it says least to greatest or greatest to least, because that will change your answer. Greatest. Remember, I start in the greatest place value, the ones place. Here I see a 1. None of the rest of my numbers have a number or a digit in the ones place. So that automatically tells me this is the greatest number, number 1. Now I have to go back to these numbers that are left. When I look in the ones place, they'll have a 0. So I go to the tenths place. Well, 8 is the greatest number there, and there's 2 numbers with that digit in the tenths place. So I have to go to the hundredths place. And when I do that, this has a 3, this number, and this has a 2. And 3 is greater than 2, so this is going to be second on my list. This will be third, and then automatically this is number 4. This is my least number. Also, it has the least digit in the tenths place, so that's another reason why it's the smallest number. So on your line, you should have written 1 and 823 thousandths, then 832 thousandths, then 823 thousandths, and last you should have written 732 thousandths. There you go. So now you can see it. So check your work. All right, the next section here asks for you to round the numbers to the underlined place value. Actually, I told you 2 things. Write the place value of the underlined digit and then round each number to it. So write the place value, then round. 2 things. So if we look here at number 3, we have this number, 829 thousandths, and the tenths place is underlined. So you should have written 2 things on this line. If I had to write the place value that's underlined, then I write tenths. And then to round the number, I look at this underlined digit. I look directly to the right of it. And if the number is a 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, I leave the underlined digit alone. And if this number next door is a 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, I leave this underlined digit alone. If it's 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, I take this underlined digit and bump it up 1. So it's either going to be an 8 or it's going to be a 9. Well, in this case, my number is 2. So in this instance, I'm going to leave my 8 alone. So I'm going to put my 0 placeholder, and then I'm going to put 8 tenths. I'm not going to write the zeros after it because I'm rounding to the tenths place. So if you wrote 800, you need to get out of the habit of writing those extra zeros because we didn't round to the thousandths place. We rounded to the tenths place. So this is the correct answer, and both parts have to be there if it asks you for both things. All right, let's look at number 4. We have 7 and 918 thousandths. So in this case, we're rounding to the ones place. And when I look next door to the ones place in the tenths place, the next greatest place value, there's a 9 there. And what I know about rounding is that if there's 5 through 9 next door as the neighbor, I'm going to take this number, I'm going to bump it up or move it up 1. So the 7 becomes an 8, and we rounded to the ones place. You could put the decimal point, but don't put any zeros after it. because we're rounding to the ones place. There's no extra zeros after it to hold its place. So it should be 8, and that we rounded to the ones place. All right, our last one for this section is number 5, and it's 11 and 507 thousandths, and this 0 is underlined in the hundredths place. So again, I like to point an arrow next door. That arrow points to the digit that tells me what's happening with my 0. My 0 is either going to stay a 0 or it's going to round up to 1. So all of these digits before have to be left the same because we're rounding it just to this place value. Nothing about the rest of this number here changes, only the digits to the right of it. So since I'm pointing at a 7, that tells me this 0 is going to become a 1, and I just rounded this number to the hundredths place. So I get 11 and 51 hundredths when I round this number to the place value that was underlined. So that was all the practice they gave you on rounding. So now we're going to move down to the bottom section of the paper where they asked you to add or subtract decimals. And some of them are written horizontally and some of them are written vertically on top of each other. So where it said estimate, I told you you did not need to do that. All you need to do is find the sum or add and the difference or subtract. So problem number 1 said 8 and 5/10 plus 1 and 8/10. So remember, really important, especially on your test where there's going to be some word problems. When you're writing these out, you've got to line up the place values. If you need to get graph paper, there's plenty of it, so please go get yourself some. So I'm going to start in the smallest place value, the tenths place, and I know 8 plus 5 is 13. So I write down the 3, regroup the 1, add my decimal point so I don't forget, and then 8 plus 1 is 9, 9 plus 1 is 10. So you should have gotten 10 and 3/10 as your answer. And that was number 1. Number 2, it's a subtraction problem. 26 and 42 hundredths minus 9 and 8/10. So what we had talked about earlier is that you could put a 0 here as your placeholder if you wanted to, because there really is a 0 there. I start all the way over here on the right in the smallest place value, the hundredths, and 2 minus 0 is 2. 4 minus 8. I cannot do that. So I'm going to go over here to the ones place and borrow 1. The 6 becomes a 5. I add 10 to whatever number is already there. 10 plus 4 is 14. And 14 minus 8 is 6. I put my decimal point. 5 minus 9 I can't do. So I'm going to go to the tens place, borrow 1. 10 plus 5 is 15. 15 minus 9 is 6. And then 1 minus, there's a 0 here. 1 minus 0 is 1. So you should have gotten 16 and 62 hundredths for number 2 on page 77. All right, number 3 was 8 and 26 hundredths plus 47 hundredths. So this is an addition problem. So you really have to pay attention. They're mixing up addition and subtraction with one another. So 6 plus 7 in the hundredths place is 13. Put down the 3, regroup the 1. 2 plus 1 is 3. 3 plus 4 is 7. And then 8 plus 0 is 8. So you should have gotten 8 and 73 hundredths. Number 4. 7 and 6 hundredths minus 1 and 95 hundredths. So I start over in the hundredths place. 6 minus 5 is 1. 0 minus 9 I cannot do, so I have to go to the ones place, borrow 1. 7 becomes a 6. 10 plus 0 is 10. So 10 minus 9 is 1. I'm going to add my decimal point so I don't forget it. 6 minus 1 is 5. So I got 5 and 11 hundredths for this problem. That was number 4. All right, now number 5, they tried to get tricky with you, and they only gave you a whole number. which means that everything after the decimal point is a 0. So you had to do some regrouping here, because on the bottom they gave you 5 and 392 thousandths. So this might have been a problem that you got tripped up on if you weren't careful. So if I have zeros up here, I cannot have a 0 and take 2 away from it. I have to borrow. And because I have zeros in the thousandths place, hundredths place, and tenths place, I have to go all the way to the ones place in this case to borrow. So I'm going to borrow 1 from the ones place, and 4 becomes a 3. Then this, if I break it down, turns into 10 tenths, but I have to borrow 1 from there. So now I have 9. And I'm going to break my tenths into hundredths. I'm going to get 10 of those, and I'm going to borrow 1 from there to make 10 tenths into thousandths. So now I can go ahead and subtract. Now 10 minus 2 is 8. 9 minus 9 is 0. 9 minus 3 is 6. Add my decimal point. Now I cannot subtract 3 minus 5, so I'm going to borrow from the tens place. 10 plus 3 is 13. 13 minus 5 is 8. And 1 minus 0 is 1. So you should have gotten 18 and 608 thousandths for this problem. There was a lot of regrouping there. It's kind of like when we subtracted across zeros when we were doing whole numbers. It can get tricky if you're not careful. Now the last one is 3 numbers that you're adding together. So it's same concept, just an extra number that you're adding here. Same thing, which is important to line up the place values. So here in the hundredths place, you really have a 0. So 6 plus 4 in the hundredths place is 10. Regroup the 1. 6 plus 1 is 7. 7 plus 1 is 8. 8 plus 3 is 11. Then I'm going to put my decimal point down. 3 plus 1 is 4. 4 plus 2 is 6. 6 plus 1 is 7. So you should have got 7 and 10 hundredths. So that's the end of the Chapter 3 practice. And now Mrs. Flights is going to give you your math test from Chapter 3. You're going to tear it out of your math book, and you will work out all your work. If you need graph paper, scratch paper, go get it. And you're going to turn in your test to the brown basket when you're all done. Please make sure to show all of your work so I can give you credit if you missed something on there, but you got partial credit, so I can give you credit for that.